Shalom, Yasharallah. I've been going over the religious instruction of the Negroes in the United States of America. And I will continue where I left off on page 20. And it reads, "And considering the greatness of the profit that is received from their labors, it might be hoped that all Christian masters, those especially who are possessed of considerable numbers, should also be at some small expense in providing for the instruction of these poor creatures and the others whose numbers are less and who dwell in the same neighborhood. Some should join in the expense of a common teacher for the Negroes belonging to them. The Society for Propagating the Gospel in Foreign Parts, as sufficiently sensible of the great importance and necessity of such an established and regular provision for the instruction of the Negroes, and earnestly wish and pray that it may please God to put it into the hearts of good Christians, to enable them to assist in the work by seasonable contributions for that end. But at present their fund does scarce enough them to answer the many demands of missionaries for the performance of divine service in the poorer settlements, which are not in a condition to maintain them at their own charge. But it is further pleaded that the instruction of heathens in the Christian faith is in order to their baptism, and that not only the time to be allowed for instructing them would be an abatement from the profits of their labor, but also that the baptizing them when instructed would destroy both the property which the masters have in them as slaves bought with their money, and the right of selling them again at pleasure, and that the making them Christians only makes them less diligent and more ungovernable. To which it may be very truly replied that Christianity in the embracing of the gospel does not make the least alteration in civil property or in any of the duties which belong to civil relations, but in all these respects it continues persons just in the same state as it found them. The freedom which Christianity gives is a freedom from the bondage of sin and Satan, and from the dominion of men's lust and passions and inordinate desires. But as to their outward condition, whatever that was before, whether bond or free, their being baptized and becoming Christians makes no manner of change in it. As St. Paul has expressly told us, 1 Corinthians 7:20, where he is speaking directly to this point, let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. And at the 24th verse, let every man wherein he is called therein abide with God. And so far as Christianity from discharging men from the duties of the station or conditions in which it found them, that it lays them under stronger obligations to perform those duties with the greatest diligence and fidelity, not only from the fear of man, but from a sense of duty to God, and the belief and expectation of a future account. So that to say that Christianity tends to make men less observant of their duty in any respect is a reproach that it is very far from deserving, and a reproach that is confuted by their duty in any aspect and respect, is a reproach that it is very far from deserving, and a reproach that is confuted by the whole tenor of the gospel precepts, which inculcate upon all and particularly upon servants, many of whom were then in the condition of slaves, a faithful and diligent discharge of the duties belonging to their several stations out of conscience towards God. And it is also confuted by our own reason, which tells us how much more forcible and constant the restraint of conscience is than the restraint of fear. And last of all, it is confuted by experience, which teaches us the great value of those servants who are truly religious, compared with those who have no sense of religion. As to their being more ungovernable after baptism than before, it is certain that the gospel everywhere enjoins not only diligence and fidelity, but also obedience for conscience sake. It does not deprive masters of any proper methods of enforcing obedience, where they appear to be necessary. Humanity forbids all cruel and barbarous treatment of our fellow creatures, and will not suffer us to consider a being that is endowed with reason on a level with brutes. And Christianity takes not out of the hands of superiors any degree of strictness and severity that fairly appear to be necessary for the preserving subjection and government. The general law, both of humanity and of Christianity, is kindness, gentleness, and compassion towards all mankind, of what nation or condition soever they be. And therefore we are to make the exercise of those amiable virtues our choice and desire, and to have recourse to severe and vicious methods unwillingly and only out of necessity. And of this necessity you yourselves remain the judges, as much after they receive baptism as before, so that you can be in no danger of suffering by the change. And as to them, the greatest hardships that the most severe master can inflict upon them is not to be compared to the cruelty of keeping them in the state of heathenism and depriving them of the tokens of salvation as reached forth to all mankind in the gospel of Christ. And in truth, one great reason why severity is at all necessary to maintain governing is the want of religion in those who are to be governed, and who therefore are not to be kept to their duty by anything but fear and terror, that which there cannot be a more uneasy state, either to those who govern or those who are governed. 3. That these things may make the greater impression upon you, let me beseech you to consider yourselves not only as masters, but as Christian masters, who stand obliged by your profession to do all that your station and condition enable you to do, towards breaking the power of Satan and enlarging the kingdom of Christ, and as having a great opportunity put into your hands of helping on this work by the influence which God has given you over such a number of heathen idolaters who still continue under the dominion of Satan. In the next place, let me beseech you to consider them not barely as slaves and upon the same level with laboring beasts, but as men slaves and women slaves, who have the same frame and faculties with yourselves, and have souls capable of being made eternally happy, and reason and understanding to receive instruction in order to it. If they came from abroad, let it not be said that they are as far from the knowledge of Christ in a Christian country as when they dwelt among pagan idolaters. If they have been born among you and have never breathed any air but that of a Christian country, let them not be as much strangers to Christ as if they had been transplanted as soon as born into a country of pagan idolaters, hoping that these and like considerations will move you to lay this matter seriously to heart and excite you to use the best means in your power towards so good and pious a work. I cannot omit to suggest to you one of the best motives that can be used for disposing the heathens to embrace Christianity, and that is the good lives of Christians. Let them see in you and in your families examples of sobriety, temperance, and chastity, and of all the other virtues and graces of the Christian life. Let them observe how strictly you oblige yourselves and all that belong to you to abstain from cursing and swearing, and to keep the Lord's day and the ordinances which Christ hath appointed in the gospel. Make them sensible by the general tenor of your behavior and conversation that your inward temper and disposition is such as the gospel requires. That is to say, mild, gentle, and merciful, and that as often as you exercise vigor and severity, it is wholly owing to their idleness or abstinency. By these means you will open their hearts to instruction and prepare them to receive the truths of the gospel, to which if you add a pious endeavor and concern to see them duly instructed, you may become the instrument of saving many souls, and will not only secure a blessing from God upon all your undertakings in this world, but entitle yourselves to the distinguishing reward in the next, which will be given to all those who have been zealous in their endeavors to promote the salvation of men and enlarge the kingdom of Christ, and that you may be found in that number at the great day of accounts, is the severe desire and earnest prayer of your faithful friend, Edom, London. The Bishop of London's letter to the missionaries in the English plantations, exhorting them to give their assistance toward the instruction of the Negroes of their several parishes in the Christian faith. Good brother, having understood by many letters from the plantations and by the accounts of persons who have come from thence, that very little progress hath hitherto been made in the conversion of the Negroes to the Christian faith, I have thought it proper for me to lay before the masters and mistresses the obligations they are under to promote and encourage that pious and necessary work, that I have done in a letter directed to them, of which you will receive several copies in order to be distributed to those who have Negroes in your parish. And I must entreat you, when you put the letter into their hands, to enforce the design of it by any argument that you shall think proper to be used, and also to assure them of your own assistance in carrying on the work. I am aware that in the plantations where the parishes are of so large extent, the care and labor of the parochial ministers must be great. But yet I persuade myself that many vacant hours may be spared from the other pastoral duties to be bestowed on this, and I cannot doubt of the readiness of every missionary in his own parish to promote and further a work of charitable to the souls of men, and so agreeable to the great end and design of his mission. As to those ministers who have Negroes of their own, I cannot but esteem it their indispensable duty to use their best endeavors to instruct them in the Christian religion in order to their being baptized, both because such Negroes are their proper and immediate care, and because it is in vain to hope that other masters and mistresses will exert themselves in this work, if they see it wholly neglected or but coldly pursued in the families of the clergy, so that any degree of neglect on your part in the instruction of your own Negroes would not only be withholding from them the inestimable benefits of Christianity, but would evidently tend to obstructing and defeating the whole design in every other family. I would also hope that the schoolmasters in the several parishes, part of whose business it is to instruct youth in the principles of Christianity, might contribute somewhat towards the carrying on this work by being ready to bestow upon it some of their leisure time, and especially upon the Lord's Day, when both they and the Negroes are most at liberty, and the clergy are taken up with the public duties of their function. And though the assistance they give to this pious design should not meet with any reward from men, yet their comfort may be that it is the work of God and will assuredly be rewarded by him. And the less they are obliged to this on account of any reward they receive from men, the greater will their reward be from the hands of God. I must therefore entreat you to recommend it to them in my name, and to dispose them by all proper arguments and persuasions to turn their thoughts seriously to it, and to be always ready to offer and lend their assistance at their leisure hours. And so, not doubting your ready and zealous concurrence in promoting this important work, and earnestly begging a blessing from God upon this and all your other pastoral labors, I remain your affectionate friend and brother, EDM. London, May 19, 1727. Dean Stanhope of Canterbury states in his sermon, 1714, that success had attended the efforts of the society, and speaks of children, servants, and slaves catechized. Bishop Berkeley was in the colony of Rhode Island from 1728 till late in 1730, and he also preached a sermon before the society, February 18, 1731, in which he thus speaks of the Negroes. The Negroes in the government of Rhode Island are about half as many more than the Indians, and both together scarce amount to a seventh part of the whole colony. The religion of these people, as is natural to suppose, takes after that of their masters. Some few are baptized, several frequent the different assemblies, and far the greater part none at all. An ancient antipathy to the Indians, whom it seems are first planters therein, as is certain other peculiars, expecting to imitate Jews rather than Christians. Read that again. An ancient antipathy to the Indians, whom it seems are first planters therein, as in certain other particulars, affecting to imitate Jews rather than Christians. Imagine they had a right to treat on the foot of Canaanites or Amalekites together with an irrational contempt of the blacks as creatures of another species who had no right to be instructed or admitted to the sacraments, have proved a main obstacle to the conversion of these poor people. To this may be added an enormous notion that the being baptized is inconsistent with the state of slavery. To undeceive them in this particular, which had too much weight, it seemed a proper step if the opinion of His Majesty's Attorney and Solicitor General could be procured. This opinion they charitably sent over, signed with their own hands, which was accordingly printed in Rhode Island and dispersed through the plantations. I heartily wish it may produce the intended effect. It must be owned our reformed planters, with respect to the natives and the slaves, might learn from the Church of Rome how it is their interest and duty to behave. Both French and Spaniards take care to instruct both them and their Negroes in the Popish religion, to the reproach of those who profess a better. From a proposal to establish a college in Bermuda, first published in 1725, the bishop remarks, "Now the clergy sent over to America have proved, too many of them, very meanly qualified, both in learning and morals, for the discharge of their office. And indeed, little can be expected from the example or instruction of those who quit their native country, or no other motive than that they are not able to procure a livelihood in it, which is known to be often the case. To this may be imputed the small care that hath been taken to convert the Negroes of our plantations, who, to the infamy of England and scandal of the world, continue heathen under Christian masters and in Christian countries, which would never be if our planters were rightly instructed and made sensible that they disappointed their own baptism by denying it to those who belong to them, that it would be of advantage to their affairs to have slaves who should obey in all things their masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart as fearing the Most High, or fearing God. That gospel liberty consists with temporal servitude, and that their slaves would only become better slaves by being Christians." Berkeley Works, copied by Rev. Reverend W. Ells, E-E-L-L-S. In 1741, Archbishop Secker, after enumerating other successes, adds, "In less than 40 years, great multitudes of the whole of Negroes and Indians brought over to the Christian faith." Bishop Drummond, in 1754, notices the Negroes in his sermon before the society and insists upon the duty and safety of giving them the gospel. The Amiable Porteous, 1783, when Bishop of Chester, afterwards Bishop of London, took a lively interest in this work and preached a sermon before the society in support of it, which may be found in his works. In the year 1783, and the following, soon after the separation of our colonies from the mother country, the society's operations ceased, leaving in all the colonies 43 missionaries, 2 of whom were in the southern states, 1 in North and 1 in South Carolina. The affectionate valediction of the society to them was issued in 1785, thus determined the connection of this noble society with our country, which, from the foregoing notices of its efforts, must have accomplished a great deal for the religious instruction of the Negro population. Thus, it is perceived that the Negroes were not forgotten by the Church of Christ in England. Were they remembered by the Church of Christ in the colonies themselves? We have no record of missions or of missionary stations established by or in any other colonies in behalf exclusively of the Negroes up to the year 1738. 1738. The Moravian or United Brethren were the first who formally attempted the establishment of missions exclusively to the Negroes. A succinct account of their several efforts down to the year 1790 is given in the report of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel Among the Heathen at Salem, North Carolina, October 5th, 1837, by Reverend J. Renatus Smith, and is as follows. 100 years have now elapsed since the renewed Church of the Brethren first attempted to communicate the gospel to the many thousand Negroes of our land. In 1737, Count Zinzendorf paid a visit to London and formed an acquaintance with General Oglethorpe and the trustees of Georgia, with whom he conferred on the subject of the mission to the Indians, which the Brethren had already established in that colony in 1735. Some of these gentlemen were associates under the will of Dr. Bray, who had left funds to be devoted to the conversion of the Negro slaves in South Carolina, and they solicited the Count to procure them some missionaries for this purpose. On his objecting that the Church of England might hesitate to recognize the ordination of the Brethren's missionaries, they referred the question to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Potter, who gave it as his opinion that the Brethren, being members of an Episcopal church whose doctrines contain nothing repugnant to the 39 Articles, ought not to be denied free access to the heathen. This declaration not only removed all hesitation from the minds of the trustees as to the present application, but opened the way for the labors of the Brethren amongst the slave population of the West Indies, a great and blessed work which has, by the gracious help of God, gone on increasing even to the present day. The same year, Brother Peter Bowler was deputed to commence the desired mission, with Brother George Sculius as his assistant. They set out by way of London in February 1738 and repaired in the first instance to Georgia, hoping to be provided with means for the prosecution of their journey by the colony of the brethren already established there. Obstacles, however, being interposed through the interested views of certain individuals, this mission failed, and our brethren settling at Petersburg took charge of the Swiss colonists and their children in that town. Georgia, not being at that period a slave-holding colony, in 1739, Sculius departed this life. Peter Bogler immigrated in 1740 to Pennsylvania with the whole Georgia colony, of which he was minister, because they were required to bear arms in the war against the Spaniards, which had recently broken out. In 1747 and 1748, some brethren belonging to Bethlehem undertook several long and difficult journeys through Maryland, Virginia, and the borders of North Carolina in order to preach the gospel to the Negroes, who, generally speaking, received it with eagerness. Various proprietors, however, avowing their determination not to suffer strangers to instruct their Negroes, as they had their own ministers whom they paid for that purpose, our brethren ceased from their efforts. It appears from the letters of Brother Spangenberg, who spent the greater part of the year 1749 at Philadelphia and preached the gospel to the Negroes in that city, that the laborers of the brethren amongst them were not entirely fruitless. Thus he writes in 1751, on my arrival in Philadelphia, I saw numbers of Negroes still buried in all their native ignorance and darkness, and my soul was grieved for them. Soon after, some of them came to me requesting instruction, at the same time acknowledging their ignorance in the most affecting matter. They begged that a weekly sermon might be delivered expressly for their benefit. I complied with their request and confined myself to the most essential truths of Scripture. Upwards of 70 Negroes attended on these occasions, several of whom were powerfully awakened, applied for further instruction, and expressed a desire to be united to Christ and His church by the sacrament of baptism, which was accordingly administered to them. At the provincial synod, which was held in Philadelphia in 1747, Brother Christian Folick was commissioned to take charge of the Negroes of New York, who had evinced a great desire for the gospel, and of whom several had been already won for the Redeemer. By means of their attendance on the ministry of the Word, in 1751 he visited the scattered Negroes in New Jersey, by whom he was everywhere received with joy, and preached Christ crucified to 100 of them at once with considerable effect, besides conversing with them at their work. A painting is preserved in Bethlehem, or a painting is preserved at Bethlehem, in which the 18 first fruits from the heathen who had been brought to Christ by the instrumentality of the brethren, and had departed in the faith prior to the year 1747, are represented, dressed in their native costume and standing before the throne of Christ with palms in their hands, with the inscription beneath, "These are redeemed from among men, being the first fruits unto God and to the Lamb," Revelation 14:4. Amongst the number are Johannes, a Negro of South Carolina, and Jupiter, a Negro from New York, the graves of colored Christians who have died in the Lord are also met with several of our burial grounds in the North American congregations. At the request of Mr. Knox, the English Secretary of State, an attempt was made to evangelize the Negroes of Georgia. In 1774, the brethren Lewis Muller of the Academy at Niesky and George Wagner were called to North America, and in the year following, having been joined by brother Andrew Boasing of North Carolina, they took up their abode at Knoxboro, a plantation so called from its proprietor, the gentleman above mentioned. They were, however, almost constant sufferers from the fevers which prevailed in those parts, and Muller finished his course in the October of the same year. He had preached the gospel with acceptance to both whites and blacks, yet without any abiding results. The two remaining brethren, being called upon to bear arms on the breaking out of the War of Independence, Boasing repaired to Wachovia in North Carolina, and Wagner set out in 1779 for England. In the great Northampton revival, under the preaching of Dr. Edwards in 1725 and 1726, when for the space of 5 or 6 weeks together the conversions averaged at least 4 a day, Dr. Edwards remarks, there are several Negroes who, from what was seen in them then and what is discernible in them since, appear to have been truly born again in the late remarkable season. At a meeting of the General Association of the Colony of Connecticut, 1738, it was inquired whether the infant slaves of Christian masters may be baptized in the rite of their masters, they solemnly promising to train them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and whether it is the duty of such masters to offer such children and thus religiously to promise. Both questions were affirmatively answered. Records as reported by Dr. C. Chapin, D. Of the condition of the Negroes about this time in New England, it has been said, their lot was far from being severe. They were often brought by conscious persons for the purpose of being well instructed in the Christian religion. They had universally the enjoyment of the Sabbath as a day of rest or of devotion. Looking over the old record of entries for publications, i.e. for marriages, within the town of Boston, I observed the following among others. 1707, Negro. Essex, a Negro man of Mr. William Clark, Esquire. Geno, woman of Winstrop, Esquire. Negro, Will, registered servant of William Webster. Betty, registered servant of W.M. King, March 9th. 1710, Negroes. Charles and Peggy, Negro servants of Mr. James Barnes, July 19th. Negro. Jack, Negro servant of Samuel Bill. Esther, Negro servant of Robert Coltridge, October 27th, by which it would appear that the community was not indirect to their condition in as much as their marriages were public and legalized. 1747, direct effects direct efforts for the religious instructions of Negroes continued through a series of years were made by Presbyterians in Virginia. They commenced with the Reverend Samuel Davies, afterwards president of Nassau Hall, and the Reverend John Todd of Hanover Presbytery. Mr. Davies began his ministry in Hanover in 1747 and left Virginia about 1773 or 1774. Mr. Davies, 4 or 5 years after his settlement in Hanover, found it impossible to afford even a monthly supply of preaching to the congregations organized by him. Accordingly, he sought an assistant in Mr. John Todd, a young preacher from Pennsylvania, who was installed in the upper part of Hanover, November 12, 1752. In a letter addressed to a friend and member of the Society in London for promoting Christian knowledge among the poor in the year 1755, he thus expresses himself: "The poor, neglected Negroes who are so far from having money to purchase books that they themselves are the property of others who were originally African savages and never heard of the name of Jesus or his gospel until they arrived at the land of their slavery in America, whom their masters generally neglect and whose souls none care for, as though immortality were not a privilege common to them. As with their masters, these poor unhappy Africans are objects of my compassion, and I think the most proper objects of the Society's charity. The inhabitants of Virginia are computed to be about 30,000 men, the one half of which number are supposed to be Negroes. The number of those who attend my ministry at particular times is uncertain, but generally about 300, who give a stated attendance, and never have I been so struck with the appearance of an assembly as when I have glanced my eye to that part of the meeting house where they usually sit, adorned, for so it has appeared to me, with so many black countenances, eagerly attentive to every word they hear and frequently bathe in tears. A considerable number of them, about 100, have been baptized after a proper time for instruction, having given credible evidence not only of their acquaintance with the important doctrines of the Christian religion, but also a deep sense of them in their minds, attested by a life of strict piety of holiness, as they are not sufficiently polished to dissemble with a good grace. They express the sentiments of their souls as so much in the language of simple nature, and with such genuine indications of sincerity that it is impossible to suspect their professions, especially when attended with a truly Christian life and exemplary conduct. There are multitudes of them in different places who are willing and eagerly desirous to be instructed and embrace every opportunity of acquainting themselves with the doctrines of the gospel. And though they have generally very little help to learn to read, yet to my agreeable surprise, many of them, by dint of application in their leisure hours, have made such progress that they can intelligently read a plain author, and especially their Bibles. And pity it is that any of them should be without them. Mr. Davies furnished the Negroes with what books he could procure for them, and requested a supply from the Society of Bibles and Watts Psalms and hymns. Having received a supply, he distributed them to the great joy of the Negroes. The books were all very acceptable, but none more so than the Psalms and the hymns, which enabled them to gratify their peculiar taste for psalmody. Sundry of them have lodged all night in my kitchen, and sometimes when I have awakened about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, a torrent or sacred harmony has poured into my chamber and carried my mind away to heaven. In this seraphic exercise, some of them spend almost the whole night. I wish, sir, you and other benefactors could hear some of these sacred concerts. I am persuaded it would surprise and please you more than an oratorio or a Saint Cecilia's day. He observes, the Negroes, above all the human species that ever I knew, have an ear for music and a kind of ecstatic delight in psalmody. And there are no books they learn as so soon or take so much pleasure in as those used in that heavenly part of divine worship. On one sacramental occasion, he had the pleasure of seeing 40 of them around the table of the Lord, all of whom made a credible profession of Christianity, and several of them gave unusual evidence of sincerity, and he believed that more than 1,000 Negroes attended on his ministry at the different places where he alternately officiated. Mr. Davies writes, Dr. Bellamy in 1757, what little success I have lately had has been chiefly among the extremes of gentlemen and Negroes. Indeed, God has been remarkably working among the latter. I have baptized about 150 adults, and at the last sacramental solemnity, I had the pleasure of seeing the table graced with about 60 black faces. They generally behave well as far as I can hear, though there are some instances of hypocrisy among them. The counties in which Dr. Davies labored were Hanover, Henrica, Gotchland, Caroline, and Louisa. The Society for Propagating the Gospel in Foreign Parts, already noticed in 1745, established a school in Charleston, South Carolina, under the direction of Commissary Garden. It flourished greatly and seemed to answer their utmost wishes. It had at one time 60 scholars and sent forth annually about 20 young Negroes well instructed in the English language and the Christian faith. This school was established in St. Philip's Church, and some of its scholars were living in 1822, of orderly and decent characters. B.P. Meade and Dr. Dalco. Just a moment.